the details, and that's what's preventing the Canadian government from speaking up publicly right now.
Yeah, and in terms of, this is a new administration settling in at the White House, so things sometimes could take a minute, or perhaps the Trump administration doesn't want to just release it just yet. It's until we get, and then again, until we actually get the paper and can read it, we're in the dark, with the exception of the fact that some senior Canadian government sources are providing some detail to share the sort of the scope and the scale of what's coming, and the fact that the Trump administration has finally communicated to the Canadian government. That is something that has not happened throughout this entire process. You talk with senior Canadian government officials, and they'll tell you that, all we can go by is based on what the president is saying publicly. And they had to take his threats very, very seriously. And slowly over time, Trump makes the initial threat, and slowly over time, his language around tariffs really hardened. And it was around New Year. When some sources I was talking with said, it looks like this is just inevitable. It was described to me by one source, one senior Canadian government source, as a scratch that Trump wants to itch, and it's tariffs. And so the feeling and the thought and the preparation process was, okay, we have to prepare for this moment. We're going to try everything we can do to stop it from happening. We're going to present facts. We're going to present Canada's case. We're going to present the fact that, this is going to be damaging to the American economy, American jobs, and the cost of living as well. But there was a sense among sources I'd been speaking with that this was going to be inevitable, and it was something that Trump wanted to do. So that mood really took hold around New Year, and it was thought that on Inauguration Day, when Donald Trump was going to sit down and sign hundreds of executive orders, dozens of executive orders, I think he's up to 300 or so far in his first 11 days in office. But when he sat down to sign those executive orders, there wasn't tariffs included there, and there was a thought that was going to be a good day for Canada. Instead of tariffs, Donald Trump was asking for a study for the next 3 months, trade officials to go and examine trading relationships with the United States, look for things that perhaps are unfair to Americans, come back with some recommendations at the end of that study. And Canada, what I was told by a senior Canadian government source, the plan is for Canada to try to influence the outcome of that study. It was described to me as something that was going to be a challenge to do, because the officials and the departments that were going to be leading this tend to be very protectionist. And that's not necessarily surprising, but they were going to have to try and figure out a way to get Canadian influence into that report, or at least the Canadian perspective and the Canadian consideration. And so it was thought that there would be some time. And so while the Canadians who were in Washington to mark Inauguration Day, officials in Ottawa who were watching from afar, no one was going to celebrate publicly or get too excited, but there was a sense of relief on that day that things were headed in a direction that might be more manageable. And then hours later, Donald Trump was in the Oval Office signing executive orders when he was asked about tariffs about Mexico. He wasn't asked about Canada, he was asked about tariffs about Mexico. And then he offered that response where he said, well, he was thinking about tariffs on Canada and Mexico on February 1st. And that sort of the few hours between, Donald Trump signing a memo that says, let's study trade, and the relief in that moment was completely upended hours later. But one thing I was cautioned by a source was that because Canada was prepared for anything on Inauguration Day, because the Trump administration had not communicated anything directly to them about what Donald Trump was going to do either way, Canada had no choice but to prepare for that moment and be sort of in the space to respond anyway. And then, the hours later, the memo is signed, a little bit of relief, it goes away, and then all of a sudden, Canada has to prepare again. There wasn't anything to say it was clear until we really heard the firm language yesterday, and now again, we're all just waiting to see the actual paper, the actual language that Donald Trump is, formally doing this to formally start the process.
I remember that night of the inauguration well, Katie, because I had gone home thinking that the tariffs were not coming, and I was on my couch when they came, and you had to pick up the ball and run with it. So that was my reminder that you can never go home when Donald Trump is president.
You cannot.
So we won't do that today either. Thank you for that. I'm going to go back to our chief correspondent and the host of The National, Adrian Arsenault. Adrian, one of the things that we are learning from the First Minister's meeting is not only the aspects of what's on the table for retaliation by Canada, but also the notion from the Prime Minister himself that this isn't about fentanyl. This is about sovereignty. This is about this country. And I'm not suggesting here that the Prime Minister is coming for the country, but he has previously, as you've talked about, talked about economic absorption and trying to create a situation where Canada can't function, and that is kind of where we're headed towards.
Well, I can tell you that Canadians reaching out to me have no doubt that this has nothing to do with fentanyl. It has nothing to do with migrants crossing the border. It has everything to do with Canadian sovereignty. I also just got off the phone with former Governor General Adrienne Clarkson. Had a lovely chat with her, but lovely is maybe not the right word, because she said a couple things. Certainly she's alarmed that this is a different game altogether, that we as Canadians, these are her words, have to cling to our values, which we believe in. It's our country, which is different from their country. We have to cling to bilingualism, reconciliation, our care for the North. We have to keep our northern border clear, the open waters in the North. Our armed forces have to be prepared or ready to understand that we've not had the investment in ourselves because we haven't needed it. And here's the line that I'm going to bet is going to send a chill down the spines of many Canadians. The next thing they will want is water. Now, this has been a conversation in this country for a long, long time. When are the Americans coming for Canada's water? There has, when people have said it in the past, they have been looked at with side eye, like, we have a good relationship, we will always work together. But there have been plans and discussions about diverting Canada's water for a very long time. Is this next? Now, Adrienne Clarkson is going to, fill out her thoughts in an op-ed that will probably be in the paper, in one of the papers in a day or two. But I can tell you that she's not alone in thinking this. I've had a number of people send me maps of old plans from the 60s to divert Canada's water. Why did California invest in growing the sort of almonds that are very water intensive? Because they always thought they would get that water from Canada. So the notion of this as an existential crisis is sadly sinking in. And I'm noticing a trend, nothing scientific here, right? It's just my email. But I'm noticing a trend in the age of the people who are writing who are most afraid. And it seems to be people who've been around for a while. Right? They have seen and fought against threats in the past and seem to say that they recognize this behavior and that it's fantastic that the politicians are focusing on the everyday for Canadians, the jobs, the auto sector, the border, but that Canadians need to have a conversation with themselves. Is this country something you want to fight for? And how do you want to fight for it? Is it something you do in your daily lives? Do you just not go to the United States anymore? Do you put up with not having oranges anymore? Do you will that make a difference broadly, economically? I've heard you say, Rosie, and you're right. No, buying Canadian, we can't eat our way out of this. Right? We just can't eat our way out of this. Where are the Commonwealth countries is one question. And as I'm reading this, Jude, that they keep coming. Where are the Commonwealth countries? So I think these are the conversations that are coming. They are serious. We're not in the business here of being alarmist. There's no way. Our job here is to be calm and collected and try to deal with the facts in front of us. But I can tell you that to be myopic about this right now and to only look at what is in front of us today is probably geopolitically a mistake for Canada. They have to this country has to reevaluate how it survives and where its friends are, and not take any of them for granted, because apparently they can go away with a stroke of a pen.
Adrienne, thank you for that. My inbox also blowing up in a way that I have not experienced since an election. So you're right, the engagement level is real here and probably will be needed in the weeks ahead in terms of how we respond. Thank you for that. The CBC's chief correspondent, Adrienne Arsenault in Toronto. We are going to bring in Juan Carlos Baker now from Mexico. He's the former deputy trade minister for Mexico and a researcher at the Pan American University. Juan Carlos, thank you for joining us.
Rosemary, my pleasure to be with you in this very troubling afternoon.
Yeah, it does look beautiful there where you are, but we're going to talk about what is a very challenging day for both of our countries, because obviously we're focused on the impact here in Canada, but give us a sense of what 25% tariffs on Mexico starting Tuesday will mean for your country.
Well, obviously, once those tariffs are confirmed, the effect will be, as you were saying with the previous speaker, very much felt immediately. Very much like the Canadian industries in Mexico, a substantial part of our manufacturing base is linked to the United States. We are the U.S.'s largest trading partner, and in that sense, the fact that we will have to pay now tariffs, once it is confirmed, and still details, as you were saying, are not entirely clear. But nonetheless, the mere possibility of having such disruptions inserted into the supply chains and the exports of Mexico are already causing a significant degree of alarm. I have to say that throughout the week before today, President Sheinbaum in Mexico had been reassuring the public, stating that we needed to wait until the decision of Donald Trump came. That apparently has taken now a much more fuller form. But nonetheless, that despite what the U.S. decides, Mexico needs to be ready and Mexico needs to be quick in its response to the United States. It has also been suggested that Mexico will retaliate in the same degree and level that the U.S. does, which, as I know, Canada will do as well.
Juan Carlos, I'm going to have to let you go, and I do apologize, but it's just we are getting confirmation now that the president has signed the order on the tariff, along with some further details. I hope you will come back and we can talk more about the impact directly on your country as well. Thank you for that, sir. And so, as we were telling you, we do have confirmation at this hour that the president has signed the tariff orders, and we are getting some more details about what's in them. David, I don't know if you have it or if Katie has it. I don't know who wants to jump in here.
I've got the White House fact sheet here. If Katie has
Okay.
more, she can jump into this. I'm going to read this. This is
I'll start with
coming
you,
up.
and then Katie, you can jump in too.
Can I just caution one thing first?
Yeah,
Is this the thing that I sent to Hill News because it's from a news organization? I did not get it directly from the White House. It's from a very Oh, is it from the White House directly?
This
We
is
have
from
a-
the White House, the fact sheet,
yeah.
it says, yeah.
Right,
Okay,
so
but I just want to. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, why don't we just start with the alerts, and Katie, you have a look and see what you can see. The White House says that retaliation clause calls for further action, likely increased tariffs if needed. It confirms what we've been reporting, that there will be a 25% tariff on Canadian exports and exports from Mexico. That will go into place on Tuesday. David, do you want to pick up there?
Yeah, the fact sheet that has moved on the wires from either the Associated Press or Reuters, it says, fact sheet, President Donald J. Trump imposes tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China, addressing an emergency situation. The extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs, including deadly fentanyl, constitutes a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So that is the instrument that is being used. It has been discussed throughout the afternoon. Until the crisis is alleviated, President Trump is implementing a 25% additional tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico and a 10% additional tariff on imports from China. Energy resources from Canada will have a lower 10% tariff. No energy carve-out for Mexico. President Trump is taking bold action to hold Mexico, Canada, and China accountable to their promises of halting illegal immigration and stopping poisonous fentanyl and other drugs from flowing into our country. The orders make clear that the flow of contraband drugs like fentanyl to the United States through illicit distribution networks has created a national emergency, including a public health crisis. Chinese officials have failed to take action necessary to stem the flow of precursor chemicals to known criminal cartels and shut down money laundering by transnational criminal organizations. In addition, the Mexican drug trafficking organizations have an intolerable alliance with the government of Mexico. The government of Mexico has afforded safe havens for the cartels to engage in the manufacturing and transportation of dangerous narcotics, which collectively have led to the overdose deaths of hundreds of thousands of American victims. This alliance endangers the national security of the United States, and we must eradicate the influence of these dangerous cartels. There is also a growing presence of Mexican cartels operating fentanyl and nitazene synthesis labs in Canada. A recent study recognized Canada's heightened domestic production of fentanyl and its growing footprint within international narcotics distribution.
Okay,
Next section.
I'm going to stop you there, I think,
Sure.
David, just because it is a long fact sheet, and I think that gives us a couple of points to jump off on in terms of what he is using and what he is pointing to. So he
Yes.
is, as we suggested, using this 1977 Economic Emergency Powers Act that allows you to point to a national emergency to impose tariffs immediately. The emergency in this case, he says, is the opioid crisis in the country, and he is pointing to Mexico, Canada, and China as the sources of that fentanyl. Katie, you're looking at this as well. Anything jump out to you there? And I'll come back to David so he can go through it as well.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump also includes a mention of trade deficit. So here we go. It's not just about fentanyl, it's also about trade deficit. So here's a key part here. While trade accounts for 67% of Canada's GDP, 73% of Mexico's GDP, and 37% of China's GDP, it only accounts for 24% of US GDP. However, in 2023, the US trade deficit in goods was the world's largest at over $1 trillion. Tariffs are a powerful, proven source of leverage for protecting the national interest. President Trump is using the tools at hand to take decisive action that puts American safety and our national security first. So what has been written down in this fact sheet is mentions the concerns about illegal drugs, but also a mention of the trade deficit there. And then he goes on to talk about, President Donald Trump is keeping his promise to stop the flood of illegal aliens and drugs, as the language is in this. Donald Trump has said that promised voters that he would shut the southern U.S. border to stop migrants from entering the country. And it says that voters have given him a mandate to do it. So this is all within the wheelhouse of the threats that Donald Trump has been making ever since he made his initial threat, and how the goalposts have kind of changed. Okay, so
He also says a little bit later, because we're all just going through this and trying to bring it to people. He also says the tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country. So that isn't really a timeline that we would understand. And they point to the president's success in using tariffs against Colombia when he was trying to send people that have been deported from the United States back to Colombia. He used tariffs to convince them to take those planes. David, you're reading a little bit more. Anything else you want to highlight there?
There is an alert here that the White House says there's a retaliation clause, calls for further action and likely increased tariffs. So this is what we were saying the warning was, is that if there is a retaliation from Canada or Mexico back to the United States on this, that there would be further retaliation and an increase in the tariffs from the United States. Now, this is what is informing the decisions and consensus that is being made now in the meeting of the first ministers that is happening. Kate McKenna has in our newsroom, has added to some of the reporting we had earlier that they're now looking at a full $150 billion retaliatory package right out of the gates on day one. The Canadian government is. That they initially talked about between 25 and 40 billion is the range we're hearing, and then another 110 to 125 that will come later. They're now talking about doing the total 150 billion right out of the gate in response to this. Because, Rosie, on its face, what this is this is an unprecedented, extraordinary trade action for an indefinite and arbitrary period of time, right, to deal with the fentanyl issue. And what is the metric here? What is the change? I mean, presumably, they want to see like a massive crackdown on suspected super labs and all kinds of drug raids, and their argument that somehow Canada has become like this massive source of fentanyl into the United States. Even though the seizure numbers wouldn't suggest that. Yes, there are super labs that have been busted in Canada, but a lot of that drug stays in the country. So what is the data and the metric behind this? That is going to be a very difficult thing to figure out. And how do you satisfy this demand? How do you comply with this demand in this moment when the stakes are so high and things are so expensive? So the retaliation clause is there. The tariff on Canada revokes the de minimis waiver, which has to do with duty-free or purchases under a certain amount going across the border. And the White House is saying that the lowered Canadian tariff on energy is to minimize the rise in costs. So this is interesting in that the 25% is across the board. to try to use economic force to force Canada to do something to satisfy the demands of the President of the United States. We all know that that is going to lead to an increase in costs inside the United States. But to blunt against the full effect of the costs, the White House is saying this is why the tariff on energy is lower. The threat, the warning had been from Canada that the full 25% tariff had applied to the oil and gas imports into the United States to go to the refiners, that the price of a gallon of gasoline would go up by about 75 cents. This is to halt that, keep it down, and not pass it on to the pumps to American consumers. The counter argument that had been considered on this side of the border was, do you put a tax, an export tax, on the energy so that they don't get that discount anymore, that you do make them pay the full price of this action. That has been a source of real division at the First Minister's table, and some warnings on that because of the economic consequences here should Canada do that, given the role oil plays in the economy of Canada. And now with the retaliation clause on top of all of that, what the Prime Minister says when he finally emerges to respond to this, Rosie, is going to be very fascinating, because what a tightrope the government of Canada has to walk with a president like this taking actions like the ones we're now seeing.
Okay, let me bring in Katie to see, Katie, if you have anything to add now that we have this document that outlines very clearly what the president is using to justify these actions.
Yeah, and just want to clarify for anyone who's watching, I was like, wait a minute, is that our statement? Because I forwarded something to the office and I wasn't sure if it had been confirmed. So we now have our own copy. I just got a copy from the White House. So it's all, anyway, and it was from Reuters, so we're all good. Anyway, so if anyone was wondering why I was saying that, it was just because I just wanted to make sure
you're
that...
careful, you're a good journalist, yes.
Well, I didn't want to send something to the office that wasn't confirmed, so I just want to be, anyway. I have just reached out, I have just replied to the White House to say, can we get some details of this so-called retaliation clause, what we know has been communicated to Canadian officials. It's from my fast reading here, I don't see anything in here about the retaliation clause, unless I am missing something, as we are all sort of going through this as quickly as we can. What really stands out to me here is that
She used to
this
be
is
on
going to sound
City.
like a weird observation,
CTV.
but that this is actually happening. I know that Donald Trump, when he makes a threat, you have to take it seriously, and then he follows through on what he does. But because of the economic impact and the consequences and what this is actually going to do for the economies in the United States, in Canada, and in Mexico, and what it's going to do to the integrated North American supply chain, I'm not surprised it happened, but it happened. Perhaps I am surprised it happened. And it's all laid out here. Donald Trump declaring addressing an emergency situation. So he's using this never before used power that the president has brought in 1977. It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Never before tested, and it can bring in tariffs the fastest. All the other options required studies or had some sort of limits around how long they could be in place for. This just gives the president the power to take these actions and move forward. And Trump has already declared an emergency along the southern border due to the migration crisis. And in this language of this statement, the fact sheet, it is a fact sheet from the White House.
Can I interrupt you just for a second,
Yeah,
Katie?
go
Because there's a
ahead.
couple things moving on the wires, and then you can pick up on that. Or
Go
on what
ahead,
I'm about
go
to
ahead.
say. So the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, are the ones leading this effort. That is interesting only because Melanie Joly recently spent a fair bit of time with Marco Rubio and tried to make Canada's case. The White House also says, according to the wires, that Mexico has been by far the most cooperative so far, which might be news to Canada as well. Katie, I'll get you to pick up on those 2 points there.
I'm going to start with the Marco Rubio point. So you know what was really interesting about that is that Melanie Joly has made a connection with him. They have spent, I believe they've met a couple of times now. I don't think it's just once. What's interesting is that after Melanie Joly had that first meeting with Marco Rubio, that Marco Rubio sat down for an extensive conversation with Megyn Kelly, a former Fox News host who now has a podcast. And they had a lengthy, basically an hour-long conversation where they talked about a broad range of topics, but a good chunk of that had to do with Canada, Mexico, tariffs, and China as well. Most of it was about
Yes,
China.
I got it.
But the way that Marco Rubio talked about Canada, he said, listen, we are their friends, but we do have some issues that we need to work on. And when Megyn Kelly pressed him to say, listen, do we know whether tariffs are coming or not this weekend? Marco Rubio, just 48 hours before this moment, said that's going to be a decision for the president. So it suggests to me that, or it just illustrates, and it's another illustration that Donald Trump is the key decision maker in all of these kinds of things, that the decision making will be in the executive branch, in the Oval Office, at the White House, and that while Canadians might try to go through channels like Marco Rubio to make that case. One other thing, Rosie, did you say Stephen Miller is the other person who's leading it?
That's right.
Okay, so Canadians might not know Stephen Miller, but Canadians perhaps know Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller was an advisor during the first Trump administration, has a senior role again this time. Stephen Miller has been highly criticized for some of his positions. He had a role in the family separation policy under the Trump administration at the southern border. At the Madison Square Garden rally that Trump had in the final week of the election campaign, he went out on stage and said, let's make America for Americans again and Americans only. He has been known to be used very racially charged rhetoric. And he was also involved, I believe, in executing the ban on visitors from Muslim majority countries in the first administration. So Stephen Miller is a very hard line on immigration. That might not be the way that a lot of people would describe it, but it's certainly a hard line in the United States on immigration, and in particular with particular attention to the southern border. So with Stephen Miller's involvement in this, that would suggest to me that the focus and emphasis is going to really be on the southern border, but of course Canada is lumped into this too.
Okay, two other little pieces of information that are moving on the wires. The White House says there are no exclusions. It also says, according to the wires, the tentative plan is for tariffs to take effect Tuesday. I would imagine that is only because of some of the logistics that would go into it, not because we should expect a change of heart. The White House also confirming that the Canadian tariffs, the 10% tariff, is on all Canadian energy. And that's important because it's not just oil and gas. That would be hydroelectricity, electricity from Ontario, from Quebec, from other places.
Oh my God.
So in that case, it casts a
crazy.
much bigger net.
That's crazy.
But is all going to be taxed or tariffed at that lower rate of 10%. David, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, Rosie, as I understand it, why there is different and supplemental information coming on the wires than what we're reading in the fact sheet is that there's a briefing happening with U.S. media and White House staff where they're filling them in more on this. I'd heard of this through some government contacts here who have been hearing from U.S. media that this is what was going to be going on. So why the retaliation clause, for example, is not mentioned in the fact sheet. This is what is being told to American reporters in a briefing coming from White House staff. So like Marco Rubio, Stephen Miller playing lead roles in this, comments about Mexico being more cooperative. This is not the sort of thing that goes into a document. This is the sort of thing humans say to other human beings when giving a briefing on this. So this is what essentially is going on here, in that this is a different briefing going to the White House press pool or a select group of media who've been invited in for this deep dive sort of technical briefing on what's happening. And this is what this extra supplemental information is telling us. But it is fascinating that it's not oil, it is all energy. Which has consequences for some of Doug Ford's threats for Quebec. KSU, raise your hand. I'll let you jump in if you got something.
No, I'm just seeing something from our colleague at Bloomberg News, Josh Wingrove, who is a Canadian who covered Canadian politics. But Josh Wingrove has just published online that Trump has actually signed 3 executive orders implementing the 25% tariffs, and that the orders do have a retaliation clause. I've reached out to the White House to ask to get confirmation on the retaliation clause. And just waiting for any sort of response from White House. That's why I keep looking down at my phone to see if I'm going to get that detail. But hopefully we are going to get some more details from this. Had we been invited to this briefing, I would have gone, just so you're aware. But I suspect this is for financial journalists as well as some key American journalists as well. So this is not unusual for any administration to do this. This is kind of a normal thing with U.S. politics, with different administrations. That's not necessarily unusual. But with Josh Wingrove saying that the executive orders have actually been signed, I'm going to keep refreshing refreshing the presidential actions website, because once that's done and the language in the actual executive orders, that will be published, because the fact sheet just outlines what the plan is and the reasoning why. When we get the executive orders, that's where it's going to have more nitty-gritty detail, and perhaps we'll see the details about the retaliation clause, which again, of course, was expressed to the Canadian side earlier today.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
and Katie, if
retaliation
you're not,
clause.
so I was gonna say, if Katie's not there, Josh Wingrow's the next best thing. Good Alberta
that's
boy,
right,
we
that's
all
fair.
know him, we all worked with him.
That's right.
He is as steady
Yeah.
and as reliable a journalist as you're ever gonna meet.
I was
Yeah.
just going to say the retaliation clause we're talking about, of course, is the piece that David has reported on earlier
Yeah.
today, and that is the idea that if Canada does retaliate, that the that the United States is prepared to escalate the tariffs as they see fit. So we are pouring through this document now, just so everybody is up to speed. We now have at least a fact sheet on paper from the Trump government, the administration, outlining exactly why this is happening, or why they say it is happening, and what is going to happen, pointing largely to fentanyl as the reason for these measures, but also pointing to migration issues and trade deficits, all of the issues that we've heard from the president since he took office in terms of his problems with Canada and Mexico, and confirming again that this is going to be 25% across the board, 10% for Canadian energy. We don't clearly, I don't know, do we have a date in here? I'm not sure we have a date in this fact sheet, but we know that it's going to take place as of Tuesday. Now that we have a document, and Katie's keeping her eyes out for the executive order, which has also been signed, the Canadian government will be more likely to respond sometime soon, because they've been grappling with this information all day, David.
Yeah, and that's gonna be the test. I mean, they're scrambling just like we are, I would presume, unless the White House was kind enough to send it along to them in advance, which I'm not sure that relationship exists right now. But the conversation certainly at the First Minister's meeting that started at 4 o'clock Eastern time today was that Canada would hit back bigger than they were initially intending to do. They don't want to go full dollar for dollar up to the full $600 billion in cross-border trade, at least not initially, because they feel the blowback on the Canadian economy would just be too severe, and Canadians are going to suffer, as are Americans, from the actions the president is taking in this executive order. They don't want to compound that economic misery. The plan was to initially come in with something around $25 to $35 billion of direct action, with another, $125 to $115 billion to follow after some consultation. The discussion today, led by the Prime Minister, was that maybe they go all the way in at $250 billion right on day one. And that to counter tariffs, the retaliation would be there, and there was consensus from the premiers that that's probably the best thing to do. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Keep going, David.
Anyway.
Okay, well, and so then the question is, the retaliation clause, I don't know if that changed that thought process or emboldened that thought process. The argument that this is about fentanyl is one that has been largely rejected by people at the top of the government here, and certainly by a lot of the premiers. They do believe this is about the verbalized threat from President Trump to use economic force and economic coercion to sort of basically obliterate the sovereignty of Canada in a way, talking about getting rid of the imaginary line, or the arbitrary line in terms of the border, sort of reverse of that 1988 free trade campaign ad, where you see the eraser getting rid of the border and talking about this larger integration. That was from opponents of free trade. Now this is about using trade to sort of force Canada to buckle under to American demands. The view is that it's not really about fentanyl, despite what this fact sheet says, despite what the presidential order will allude to, and despite that being presumably the conditions to have these tariffs lifted. It is a much larger, more fundamental objective of the President of the United States to bring its northern neighbor, one of its largest trading partners, completely under the thumb of the U.S. government and U.S. interests.
Well, one other thing that our friend Josh Wingrove has pointed out is that the de minimis exemption on small shipments, so that something that would be duty-free essentially on small shipments, it is about mail and parcels, because the United States is claiming that is being exploited by the drug trade, that things are being sent through mail and parcels to feed into
like Amazon packages and things like this that Canadians are buying through the U.S. or whatever. If it's under a certain amount, people are using that to ship things.
Yes, that will affect that, but the intent is on the drugs.
I gotcha.
But you're right. You're right. It will also impact Canadians who buy a lot of things from the United States. I'm just checking to see on timing from the government. I'm told it's safe to say we will not hear from the Prime Minister at 6 p.m. hopefully, hopefully it will be sooner rather than later because I got to be back here at like 6 a.m. So I'm going to let you two catch up and do some reading there. And I'm going to bring in a guest. Tyler Meredith is the former head of economic policy for the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And he joins me now. Nice to see you, Tyler.
Nice to see you, Rosie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So we now have a lot more meat on the bone, as it were, in terms of understanding the president's thinking in terms of why he's doing this, putting these measures in place as of Tuesday. Give me a sense of what you think the government would be talking about right now behind closed doors and telling the premiers. Certainly we're hearing that they are now considering using a much bigger hammer to strike back.
Yeah. So I think the key thing is, as you and David were talking about just earlier, is the question of moving away from the phased-in approach, which I think would have been only valuable in a context where we were actually dealing with a potentially escalating strategy for the United States. Because you'll recall, there was the possibility that we would go 5, 10, 20, along the way as the pressure on Canada ramped up to try to create an incentive for us to move quickly to solve things. That is now not on the table means obviously we need to move quickly with dollar for dollar, and I'm actually very encouraged to hear the news that is being considered. I think in terms of the discussions with the premiers, I think they'll be talking about a couple of things. One is the reality that Canada's counter-tariff response is not going to happen immediately. There's a consultation process that legally we have to go through, and that probably means we are a number of weeks away from our ability to put these tariffs in place. Some will question whether or not it was right to not have listed or started that consultation process before we got today's news. The second thing will obviously be what does Canada's support package look like for people and for businesses? This is likely going to mean, if we're doing dollar for dollar tariffs, a recession that we're going to face probably in the order of about 2 to 3% of GDP. That's about half of what we experienced during COVID in the first year. And so it's going to require not the same degree of or the same kinds of tools as we had during COVID, but obviously some expansion around employment insurance, probably some supports for businesses in terms of lost income. Because what the goal is going to be, especially if this is something that isn't going to be in place for a long period of time, God willing, that there's an ability to keep people employed during this period of time, not to have them all laid off at once.
You said there has to be a consultation process. I mean, I have spoken to people that have said that there are certain things that they could do right away. Maybe it's just a certain number of items, I'm not sure, sort of symbolic items that would go into effect as of Tuesday, and then the broader list going forward. The counter tariffs, though, do have sort of a negative side, right? They do impact Canadians in a direct way as well. So I wonder how much thinking is going into that, the fact that Canadians are going to be hit kind of on both sides when it comes to this.
Absolutely. So there's two ways you can do this, maybe three. The first way is just to say we're going to match effectively the same kinds of imports and exports as the United States, and more or less try to reach the same dollar, when we say dollar for dollar, the same amount of tariff revenue that the U.S. is going to be collecting from Canadians to put that onto U.S. businesses, right? But the way we do that is actually up in the air. We could match the U.S. in the tariffs across industry and across products in the same way, but it would have different effects. We could also, however, go very targeted, right? There could be 100% tariffs on Teslas, for example. Chrystia Freeland has talked about that as recently as this week. We could decide to exempt certain things like food. We are heavily dependent on the United States for imports of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and that would have a significant inflationary impact if we were to apply a 25% tariff in that category. And so you've got to think about, do you want to match all of those things? Because at the end of the day, you got to collect. If you're trying to achieve dollar for dollar tariffs, you got to collect a certain mass of tariff revenue. You don't have to do that in the exact same way all the way across industries, because there are some things, as you rightly say, for example, in the auto trade, right? We're highly integrated. We have products that are going to cross the border 8 or 10 times before a car is finished in Canada. And so if we're tariffing that transaction multiple times, it's going to have a huge inflationary impact on the end consumer. And there are things that we want to preserve market share in, right? So part of the approach has to consider what's the end goal of what we're trying to do. We've just been through an inflationary crisis, right? That's let's be honest, had a massive political impact, both in Canada and across the world. I think governments are going to be a little careful at how they choose which products they want to go heavy on.
Although the president is not being careful, right? It's a 25% across the board, with the exception of energy. So, I mean, Americans are going to feel this right away, presumably. Whether they understand why it's happening, I don't know. But they are going to feel an impact right away.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting is that if you take energy out of the mix, right, and it's interesting that he decided to tariff it at only 10%. If you take energy out of the mix, the U.S. actually has a trade surplus with Canada. And so what the president is doing today is he is actually he's taxing U.S. exporters in a way, or ensuring that we will tax U.S. exporters in a way that will limit their market access to Canada and limit the U.S. trade surplus that they have. And so this is, this is foolhardy economics. It's not going to help the United States. It's going to largely, as I've said in other interviews, this is just a way for him to monetize the U.S. consumer to pay for his tax cut package that he wants to bring forward.
Thank you.
He needs to do that in part because he wants to bring down the deficit at the same time as he provides tax cuts. This is actually not about a trade war. And so it's an interesting question in that context. Is Canada's response, in addition to tariffs, going to include other tools?
Power
because
too.
I think you've heard a number of people from the governments rightly say, maybe we need to actually do things that will target the people around Trump, right? Elon Musk in particular, right? Because these are very influential people. And so, in the context of what David was reporting earlier about the retaliation clause, I have to wonder whether that's going to be something that's on the table.
Is there really anything? I mean, yes, we will retaliate. Yes, there'll be measures, and that's an important thing for our sovereignty and show strength. But I would imagine there is nothing Canada can do that will have as much of an impact as, the stock markets, Americans, governors, people in industry, right? So from that perspective, it's very challenging for this country to respond in any real way because the leverage is not the same.
That on a certain level, that's true. But I think what's interesting is that Trump decided to move forward with these tariffs across multiple jurisdictions all at once, right? Had he decided to start with Canada or to start with Mexico, I think we'd be having a very different discussion. The fact that he's doing Canada, China, and Mexico all in the same go means effectively that he's creating an alliance, a counterparty alliance, right? And so I think it'll be interesting to watch in the coming days as Canada try to join with these affected jurisdictions as well as others that he's talked about in terms of targeting a global tariff. Because remember, that's still on the table. That's something he promised to deliver in the election. And so do we want to partner with the European Union, for example? If we were to develop a global alliance of countries that are targeted by Trump's tariffs, there are things that we could be doing, like, for example, trying to target financial flows, right? Selling U.S. debt right now at a time in which it's very, very expensive for the U.S. government because they have one of the largest deficits in the world to finance their agenda would be a very interesting way to have leverage over the United States, to make it more expensive in the stock market to borrow and more expensive for the U.S. Treasury to do the things that they want to do. That could actually have some impact.
That would be hard, though. It would take some time to build up. I mean, we have some trade alliances, obviously, already, some free trade agreements, but to build up enough of enough of mass to take that on, that would be challenging, I would think.
It would be, but I guess what I'm saying is that I think there's two lessons we have to take from today. One is we're not alone. The second, though, is that we also need to look at other tools that go beyond simply dollar-for-dollar tariffs, because that's maybe not going to be as a lasting impact as we hope it would.
Okay, Tyler Meredith, thank you. I really appreciate you coming on and giving us some of your perspective and your expertise on this. Nice to see you.
Thanks for your time.
I'm now going to go out west to Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi. He joins us from Red Deer, Alberta this evening. Nice to see you, Naheed.
Yeah, great to be here. Lovely day here in Red Deer in the middle of Alberta.
Yeah, a difficult day for the country. I suppose the news is not quite as devastating for the energy sector, but it's still pretty bad. Give me
it's still pretty bad. It's still...
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen to? Let's talk about your province. In your province, this is going to go into effect as of Tuesday. How will it impact the province?
Yeah, so let's be clear that the challenge for the oil and gas sector across the country is a challenge for all of us. Oil and gas is by far our largest export as Canadians. So it's certainly not something that will be stuck only in Alberta. And yes, 10%, if that's true, is better than 25%. It's still really challenging. And so we have a lot of work to do. And across this whole country, we're going to see small businesses have real problems, maybe close. We're going to see people lose their jobs, not be able to afford their homes. This really is devastating, and there's real impact on real people. This isn't just about politics. It isn't just about the chaos that's being sown as part of a political strategy. It's really going to impact real people. And we have to be ready with responses, not just responses to make that mean man take the tariffs away, but responses that really wake us up in terms of how we need to restructure our own economy.
And what kind of support would you hope would come from the federal government, particularly for the energy sector out there, but for everyone?
Yeah, I think we have to focus on people as well as on industries. As far as the energy sector, 10% may well be manageable. We may still have enough of a price differential that the United States refiners are still going to take our product. That's likely true. But in the meantime, we also need to ensure that we are diversifying our export markets. It was an NDP Premier, Rachel Notley, with an able assist from the Mayor of Calgary, who got the only pipeline that we built in generations to Tidewater in the Trans Mountain expansion. So we have to make sure that we are maximizing the export capacity of Trans Mountain, that oil is not necessarily going to California as it currently does, but to international markets. We need to work with industry to ensure there's oil by rail capacity to get our oil to those export markets. And then we need to really think hard about what kinds of targeted business and income supports are needed in order to keep businesses going while we develop these markets. And again, not just in oil and gas, in agriculture, in manufactured goods, in everything we export.
What about just shutting off the taps, the energy taps to the United States?
It probably isn't going to work. The president said the other day, what can Canada do to help? And despite all our performative stuff and my premier standing at the border, the president said there is nothing we can do. So legitimately, we have to figure out what this actually means for our economy. And yes, Trump certainly believes in power. Read The Art of the Deal. And if we've got power plays to make, that will cause him to retaliate. There may be something there. We've seen curtailment before to maximize the price for our resources. But by and large, these are not things that are going to help us in any way in the long term.
Okay. Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Should tell you that the First Minister's meeting, where the Premier of Alberta has just wrapped up. So we will undoubtedly get some news out of there. We are standing by to see when the Prime Minister and federal officials will come out and speak to us. In the meantime, we have received the text of this executive order. I'm not sure if David and Katie have looked at it, but I have found that clause about the retaliation there. Katie, do you want to pick that up there? That's very clearly in there in terms of the response.
So it's in there. Not only that, it's sort of the language in the executive order is far more direct and far more harsh than what we had in that fact sheet there. Essentially, Donald Trump is expanding the national emergency that he declared at the southern U.S. border and expanding it to include sort of the scope to now include Canada. Listen to this. It says, I hereby expand the scope of the national emergency declared in that proclamation. So that was when he declared the southern border a national emergency, to cover the threat and the threat, safety and security of Americans, including the public health crisis, the failure of Canada to do more to arrest, seize, detain, or otherwise intercept other drugs, human traffickers, criminals at large, and drugs. In addition, this failure to act on the part of Canada constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat, which at its source is in substantial part outside the United States to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. So essentially, Donald Trump declaring an emergency at the southern border has now been expanded to say that Canada at the north is a threat, and it's in the same category as what's going on at the southern border, and that will give him the permission to use those Emergency Powers Act, the International Emergency Powers Act, to bring in the tariffs. We do have the language around the retaliation clause. We've got it right here. Should Canada retaliate against the United States in response to this action through import duties on United States exports to Canada or similar measures, the president may increase or expand the scope of duties imposed under this order to ensure efficiency of this action. It also goes on to say, takes effect at 12:01 a.m. February 4th. So with the exception of some goods that might be on their way now. But yeah, we officially have the text, and essentially it outlines, it labels Canada a national security threat to the United States with respect to migration and drugs entering the United States, specifically when it comes to fentanyl is raised here. Just to give a fact check to our viewing audience, in the last year, U.S. border officials seized 19.5 kilograms of fentanyl crossing from Canada into the United States over the entire year. When you compare that to the southern border, it was 9,500 at the southern border that was seized. So they are very different situations, but Donald Trump has taken the Emergency Act at the southern border, expanded it all the way up to Canada. So now Canada is lumped into this tariff threat. The tariffs begin on the 4th at 12:01 a.m. And it is all clear in that language that if Canada retaliates, the United States may consider raising the tariff rates.
David, the First Minister's, thank you for that, Katie. The First Minister's meeting has wrapped up. I know that Tyler Meredith said that there was a consultation period required in Canada for counter tariffs. I am not sure that is going to happen. And certainly previous conversations I've had suggested that there were ways around it. I don't know.
Yeah.
And perhaps the magnitude of what we're dealing with here, there are legal ways to circumvent that or do a post consultation given how severe an impact this will have.
Yeah, and these are questions we're going to need the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister to answer when they do finally speak to us. But there's a couple other things I'm reading in this executive order, and forgive me if I'm repeating some of what Katie had to say, but you get a more insight into the thinking behind this and why they're taking such a hard line on Canada, despite the fentanyl traffic being so small, even by their own admission in this. They say essentially that Canada has played a central role in the challenges, including by failing to devote sufficient attention and resources.
It's nonsense, folks. Anyways, folks, I'll wrap it up here. That's it. This is all about, it's not all about fentanyl and this and that, with drugs. This is all about, the other guest, the last guy they had on, the guest, he has it right. This is all about the taxes, collecting all the money from the taxes, the tariffs, collecting all the money for the tax cut. It pays for the tax cut he's going to give to his people. This is all about, folks. It's all about that, and it's all about power. He wants to take over Canada for real. They want the water and the natural resources. He said he doesn't need nothing from Canada. Apparently they do. They want all the minerals, their water, all the natural resources they want. A lot of gold in Canada, and the diamonds up north, and the gold. And we have lots more water than they do, I think, Canada. So this is all what this is, folks. Pure power. And this Donald Trump is a threat to how is this guy lesser of two evils? Going back to the elections, than Kamala Harris. How is he? How is he not the lesser? How is it not the lesser of two evils? Anyways, this is crazy. This guy is existential threat to the world, actually, folks. This guy is going to start a war. He's going to start World War III. He's doing this thing on Brexit too. The tariffs. Do it on Brexit too. So it's an existential threat, folks, to America, to the world. He's gonna cause a World War III. He's attacking Russia. He's gonna tariffs on Russia and China. Apparently Colombia. So he's doing Brexit countries. So he's doing tariffs all over. He's doing tariffs against everybody. So the whole world's going to be against. So everybody's going to line up. I think we're not alone. This guy's right. Somebody said we're alone. Arsenal said that, the other reporter. I think we're not. We're not going to be alone. If he does this, if he does, pisses off his allies. Piss off his allies. The US does. So he's going to have the allies joining his enemies. The whole world's going to be against this guy. This guy, I think, could be an existential threat to the world. This guy's the Nazi, even the Nazis. Even no, I guess the Nazi, well, they're not Nazi countries. Well, there's not these Nazi groups in Europe, but they're not controlling the governments. But this is actual Nazi controlling the government of the United States. It's like this is the Fourth Reich, folks. So this is a Nazi country where we live in. I mean, we're bordered against. So the whole world's gonna come against that. Eventually, if he's going crazy, bonkers. This guy's a maniac. So he's pissing off the whole world, and they're gonna go against him. So you better be careful. Now, on the other hand, he might just push the button and just end everything, or start a nuclear war. Something's gonna happen, folks. I predicted he wants to attack China too eventually. So he wants Canada and Mexico. I think he wants to take over them, and Panama. Some kind of super country to go against Russia and China, maybe. I don't know. But this guy's a lunatic. He's crazy. I think we're not taking it seriously. The Canadians are not taking it seriously. All the liberal media is not. No, they're not taking this guy seriously. This guy's a threat. He's terrible. These people are a threat. But not him himself. It's people behind it. There's people behind him who are doing this. I mean, it's in higher places they're doing this. People behind him. So he's not just him. You listen to those people, totally Nazi fascists, and this is all about white country they want to have, and white dominance, or white supremacy, actually. I mean, there's already white supremacy now, but this is extreme. Totally Nazism going on here. This is what this is. Anyways, folks, I'm way out. This is a long video. This is from a live CBC stream, but I'm out now. I'm not gonna do any more. I'm out.